Basic Exercise Science. The purpose of this lesson is to provide the fitness professional with the fundamental concepts that pertain to the definition, structure, and function of the kinetic chain. By understanding the basic anatomical structures and physiological functions, the fitness professional will gain a comprehensive insight into how the human body operates. Following this presentation, the participant will be able to define the components of the kinetic chain, describe and differentiate the structure and function of the central and peripheral nervous systems and how they relate to human movement, describe the structure and function of the bones and joints and how they relate to human movement, and describe the structure and function of the muscles and how they relate to human movement. Structure allows for and provides the basis of function. Therefore, the components that make up a structure have a drastic influence on how that structure ultimately functions. In the human body, the components that make up the human movement system include the nervous system, the skeletal system, and the muscular system. Together, these components are known as the kinetic chain and are responsible for human movement. All systems of the kinetic chain must work together to produce movement. If one system or component of the kinetic chain is not working properly, it will affect the other systems and ultimately affect movement. Therefore, it is imperative that the health and fitness professional fully understand all components of the kinetic chain and how they work together to construct efficient movement. To gain a complete understanding of the kinetic chain, it's necessary to look at the structure and function of each component. The nervous system. Starting with the nervous system. The nervous system is a communication network within the human body. It allows us to gather information about our internal and external environments, process and interpret the information, and respond. The three primary functions of the nervous system include sensory, integrative, and motor function. Sensory function is the ability of the nervous system to sense changes in either the internal or external environment, such as a stretch placed on a muscle, an internal change, or the change from walking on the sidewalk to walking on sand, an external change. Integrative function is the ability of the nervous system to analyze and interpret the sensory information to allow for proper decision-making, producing the appropriate response. Motor function is the neuromuscular response to the sensory information, such as causing the muscle to initially contract when stretched or changing our walking pattern when in the sand, as opposed to the sidewalk. The key aspect to note here is that all movement is directly dictated by the nervous system. Thus, it becomes important to train the nervous system efficiently to ensure that proper movement patterns are being developed, which enhances performance and decreases the risk of injuries. This important concept will be discussed throughout the remainder of the course. Let's now review the major components of the nervous system. The functional unit of the nervous system is known as the neuron. Billions of neurons make up the complex structure of the nervous system and provide it with the ability to communicate internally with itself as well as externally with the outside environment. Neurons are comprised of three main parts: the cell body, which houses the cell organelles such as the nucleus, mitochondria, lysosomes, and Golgi complex; the axon, which provides communication from the brain and/or spinal cord to other parts of the body; and the dendrites, which are responsible for gathering information from other structures of the body. There are three main functional classifications of neurons determined by the direction of their nerve impulses. Sensory or afferent neurons transmit nerve impulses from receptors in tissues, for example muscles, to the brain and/or spinal cord. Motor or efferent neurons transmit nerve impulses from the brain and/or spinal cord to the effector sites such as muscles or organs. Lastly, interneurons transmit nerve impulses from one neuron to another. The nervous system is comprised of two interdependent divisions. These include the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord and serves mainly to interpret information. The peripheral nervous system consists of 12 cranial nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which branch out from the brain and spinal cord, and sensory receptors. These peripheral nerves serve two main functions. First, they provide a connection for the nervous system to activate different effector sites such as muscles or motor function. Second, peripheral nerves relay information from the effector sites back to the brain via sensory receptors, the sensory function, thus providing a constant update on the relation between the body and the environment. Sensory receptors. The final component of the peripheral nervous system is the sensory receptors. The sensory receptors are specialized structures located throughout the body that are designed to transform environmental stimuli, such as heat, light, sound, taste, motion, etc., into sensory information that the brain and/or spinal cord can then interpret to produce a response. These receptors can be subdivided into 4 major categories. Mechanoreceptors, which respond to mechanical forces, such as touch and pressure. Nociceptors, which respond to pain. Chemoreceptors, which respond to chemical interaction, such as smell and taste. And photoreceptors respond to light or vision. For relevance to this course, we'll focus our attention on the mechanoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors are specialized structures that are essentially responsible for sensing distortion in tissues. This is brought about through stretch, compression, traction, and/or tension to the tissue, and then transmitted to the nervous system. Mechanoreceptors include muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors. For the relevance of this course, we'll focus on the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organ. Muscle spindles are the major sensory organs of the muscles and sit parallel to the muscle's fibers. Muscle spindles are sensitive to change in length and rate of length change. When a muscle is stretched, the spindles of that muscle are also stretched. This information is transmitted to the brain and spinal cord to update the nervous system on the status of the muscle length and the rate at which that muscle is lengthening. When excited, the muscle spindle will cause the muscle to contract. This is to prevent the muscle from stretching too far and/or too fast, either of which could otherwise cause injury. Golgi tendon organs, or GTO, are at the point where the muscle and tendon meet, or the musculotendinous junction. These receptors are sensitive to changes in muscular tension and rate of the tension change. When excited, the Golgi tendon organ will cause the muscle to relax. This is to prevent the muscle from being placed under excessive stress and sustaining injury. A basic understanding of these 2 receptors will be important, as they become key aspects in flexibility training, which will be covered in a further lesson. The skeletal system. The skeletal system is the framework for our structure and movement. It helps to determine our stature, as the positioning of our bones will determine our size and shape. Therefore, it's very important to understand that the growth, maturation, and functionality of the skeletal system is greatly affected by our posture, activity, or lack thereof, and nutrition. Further, this structure is the resting ground for the muscles of our body. A detailed listing of types of bones and bone markings are included in your text for review. For the sake of this lesson, we'll review the role the skeletal system plays in human movement. This role comes in the form of joints. Bones form junctions that are connected by muscles and connective tissue. These junctions are known as joints. Joints are the sites where movement occurs as a result of muscle contraction. Joints can be categorized by both their structure and their function, or the way they move. Joint motion is referred to as arthrokinematics, with the 3 major motion types being roll, slide, and spin. It must be noted that these motions rarely occur, if ever, as an isolated, true motion. As is typically the case with the human body, variations and combinations of these joint motions take place during functional movement. In a roll movement, one joint rolls across the surface on another, much like the tire of a bicycle rolls on the street. An example of roll in the body is the femoral condyles moving or rolling over the tibial condyles during a squat. In a slide movement, one joint surface slides across another, much like the tire of a bicycle skidding across the street. An example of slide in the human body is the tibial condyles moving or sliding across the femoral condyles during a knee extension. In a spin movement, one joint surface rotates on another, much like twisting the lid off of a jar. An example of spin in the human body is the head of the radius rotating on the end of the humerus during pronation and supination of the forearm. First and foremost, joints provide the bones a means to be manipulated, allowing for movement throughout segments of the body. Joints also provide stability, allowing for movement to take place without unwanted movement. All joints in the human body are linked together. This implies that movement of one joint directly affects the motion of others. This is an essential concept for a health and fitness professional to understand because it creates an awareness of how the body functionally operates and is the premise behind kinetic chain movement. The primary connective tissue for a joint is the ligament. Ligaments connect bone to bone and provide static and dynamic stability as well as input to the nervous system, or proprioception. Ligaments are primarily made up of a protein called collagen, with varying amounts of another protein called elastin. It's important to note that ligaments are characterized by poor vascularity, or blood supply, meaning that ligaments do not heal or repair very well and may be slower to adapt. This will be important to remember when considering the amount of rest days taken and/or the structure of your daily exercise programming plan when performing high-intensity exercise. This will be discussed further in the program design lesson in this course. The muscular system. The final component of the kinetic chain is the muscular system. The nervous system is the control center for movement production, and the skeletal system provides the structural framework for our bodies. However, in order to complete the cycle of movement production, the body must have a device that the nervous system can command to move the skeletal system. This is the muscular system. Muscles generate internal tension that, under the control of the nervous system, manipulates the bones of our body to produce movements. Muscles are the movers and stabilizers of our bodies. Skeletal muscle is the compilation of many individual muscle fibers that are neatly wrapped together with connective tissue that forms different bundles, much like a cable is made up of bundles of wires encased in an outer covering. Breaking the bundles down into layers from outer to innermost. The first bundle is the actual muscle itself, wrapped by an outer layer of connective tissue called fascia, and an inner layer immediately surrounding the muscle called the epimysium. The fascia and epimysium are also intimately connected with the bone and help to form the muscle's tendon. The next bundle of muscle fiber is called a fascicle, or fasciculus. Each fascicle is wrapped by connective tissue called perimysium. Each fascicle is in turn made up of many individual muscle fibers that are wrapped by connective tissue called endomysium. The connective tissues within the muscle play a vital role in movement. They allow the forces generated by the muscle to be transmitted from the contractile components of the muscle to the bones, creating motion. Each layer of connective tissue extends the length of the muscle, helping to form the tendon. Tendons are the structures that attach muscles to bone and provide the anchor from which the muscle can exert force and control the bone and joint. They are very similar to ligaments in that they have poor vascularity, or blood supply, which leaves them susceptible to slower repair and adaptation. As with ligaments, this will be important to remember when considering the amount of days rest taken and/or the structure of your daily exercise programming plan when performing high-intensity exercise to ensure one does not develop overuse injuries. We'll now look at the innermost component of muscles, the muscle fiber, or cell, and its contractile elements. Muscle fibers are encased by a plasma membrane known as the sarcolemma, and contain typical cell components like cellular plasma called sarcoplasm, which contains glycogen, fats, minerals, and oxygen-binding myoglobin, nuclei, and mitochondria, which transforms food into energy for the cell. However, unlike typical cells, they also have structures called myofibrils. Myofibrils contain myofilaments that are the actual contractile components of muscle tissue. These myofilaments are known as actin, thin string-like filaments, and myosin, thick filaments. The actin, thin, and myosin, thick filaments form a number of repeating sections within a myofibril. Each one of these particular sections is known as a sarcomere. A sarcomere is the functional unit of the muscle, much like the neuron is for the nervous system. It lies in the space between two Z-lines. Each Z-line denotes another sarcomere along the myofibril. Two other protein structures that are also important to muscle contraction are tropomyosin and troponin. Tropomyosin is located on the actin filament and blocks myosin binding sites located on the actin filament, keeping myosin from attaching to actin while the muscle is in a relaxed state. Troponin, also located on the actin filament, plays a role in muscle contraction by providing binding sites for both calcium and tropomyosin when a muscle needs to contract. Now that we've reviewed the different structural components that allow a muscle to contract, let's next briefly review how muscles generate force. Muscle contraction. Muscles generate force through a variety of methods. These methods, which include neural activation, the sliding filament theory, and excitation-contraction coupling mechanism, will be reviewed, starting with neural activation. Neural activation is essential for a muscle to contract, for movement and/or stabilization. This activation is generated by the communication between the nervous system and the muscular system. The motor neurons of the body are connected to the muscle fibers. A motor neuron and the muscle fibers with which it connects is known as a motor unit. The point where the neuron meets an individual muscle fiber is called the neuromuscular junction. This junction is actually a small gap between the nerve and muscle fiber, often called a synapse. Electrical impulses, also known as action potentials, are transported from the central nervous system down the axon of the neuron. When the impulse reaches the end of the axon, or the axon terminal, chemicals called neurotransmitters are released. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that cross the synapse between the neuron and muscle fiber, transporting the electrical impulse from the nerve to the muscle, much like a boat carries people from one side of a river to the other. The neurotransmitters fall into receptor sites on the muscle fiber specifically designed for their attachment, much like a square peg fits into a square hole. The neurotransmitter used by the neuromuscular system is termed acetylcholine. Once attached, acetylcholine stimulates the muscle fibers to go through a series of steps that produce muscle contractions, otherwise known as the sliding filament theory. The sliding filament theory is the proposed process of how the contraction of the filaments within the sarcomere takes place after a muscle has been given the order to contract via neural activation. A sarcomere shortens as a result of the Z-lines moving closer together. The Z-lines converge as the result of myosin heads attaching to the actin filament and asynchronously pulling, or power strokes, the actin filament across the myosin. Now let's put the two processes together to show how the process occurs in its entirety, known as the excitation-contraction coupling. Phase 1. A nerve impulse, action potential, is transmitted through the neuron and down the axon to where the axon meets the muscle fiber, neuromuscular junction, and releases acetylcholine, or ACH. Phase 2. Acetylcholine transports across the synapse and binds to its receptor on the muscle fiber. Phase 3. This continues the neural message or action potential to the muscle fiber that triggers the release of calcium into the sarcoplasm, where the actin and myosin are located. Phase 4. Calcium binds to the protein troponin. This forces the protein tropomyosin to move away from the myosin binding site and allowing for myosin to attach to actin. Phase 5. Myosin attaches to actin, creating a pull of the filaments across each other, sliding filament theory, causing the muscle to shorten or contract. Another important aspect of muscles that should be understood are the different types of muscle fibers. Essentially, they've been delineated into two main categories, type 1 and type 2 fibers. Slow-twitch type 1 muscle fibers have increased oxygen delivery, are smaller in size or diameter, slower to produce maximal tension, and are more resistant to fatigue. These fibers are important for muscles producing long-term contractions necessary for stabilization and postural control. An example would include sitting upright while maintaining ideal posture against gravity for an extended period of time. Fast-twitch type 2 muscle fibers have decreased oxygen delivery, are larger in size, quick to produce maximal tension, and fatigue more quickly than type 1 fibers. These fibers are important for muscles producing movements requiring force and power, such as performing a sprint. It's important to note, however, that all muscles have a combination of slow and fast-twitch fiber that will vary depending on the function of the muscle. Lastly, let's review the role of muscles as movers. Muscles provide the human body with a variety of functions that allow for the manipulation of forces placed on the body and to produce and slow down movement. These muscle functions categorize the muscle as an agonist, synergist, stabilizer, or antagonist. Agonist muscles are muscles that act as prime movers, or in other words, they're the muscles most responsible for a particular movement. For example, the gluteus maximus is an agonist for hip extension. Synergist muscles assist prime movers during movement. For example, the hamstring and the erector spinae are synergistic with the gluteus maximus during hip extension. Stabilizer muscles support or stabilize the body while the prime movers and the synergists perform the movement patterns. For example, transversus abdominis, internal oblique, and multifidus, deep muscles in the low back, stabilize the low back, pelvis, and hips, lumbo-pelvic hip complex, during hip extension. Antagonist muscles perform the opposite action of the prime mover. For example, the psoas, a deep hip flexor, is antagonistic to the gluteus maximus during hip extension. Summary. So in summary, the movement system of the human body is called the kinetic chain. The three components of the kinetic chain are the nervous system, the skeletal system, and the muscular system. The nervous system is comprised of billions of neurons that transfer information throughout the body through two interdependent systems, the central nervous system, or the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, the nerves that branch out from the brain and spinal cord. The skeletal system is the body's framework and is made up of bones and joints. Joints are interconnected, and movement of one will affect the others. Muscles generate internal tension that, under the control of the nervous system, manipulates the bones of our body to produce movements. Muscles are the movers and stabilizers of our bodies. Muscles generate force through neural activation, sliding filament theory, and excitation-contraction coupling. Muscles can be categorized based upon their function during a given movement. These categories include agonist, synergist, stabilizer, and antagonist.